In this Warmaster video, we're going to look at the topic of combat results, including retreats, pursuits, fallbacks, and advances. We can quickly recap the subjects of the previous video in a step-by-step guide to determine how combat is worked out. Firstly, you and your opponent determine the number of attacks you can both make and the direction those attacks must be made in. You then roll to hit, and the opponent can make their armor saves, then record any hits that are caused, then call on any infantry support, add the number of hits caused to the amount of infantry support you have to get your combat total. Whoever scores highest will be the winner. Then you remove any casualties. Once both sides fighting in a combat engagement have completed all their attacks and called upon all their infantry support, the combat round will either be a draw if both sides have scored the same, or one side will have scored more and won. If we return to our simple example of combat from the previous video, we will recall that in the first round of combat the Dogs of War swordsmen scored 5 and the skeletons only scored 3. Therefore the Dogs of War swordsmen have won the combat by 2 points. On page 43 of the rulebook we find out what happens when one side loses a round of close combat. The losing side must retreat. The distance that the losing side must retreat is equal to the difference between the two combat scores in centimeters. In our example, because the skeletons lost the combat by 2 points, they must retreat 2 centimeters. A retreating unit moves directly away from the unit that it was fighting, without changing formation and without changing facing. So in our example, the skeleton unit moves directly backwards 2 centimeters from the swordsman unit. The victorious swordsmen now get to choose what they wish to do. The winning side in a close combat engagement may choose to fall back, stand their ground, or pursue the retreating enemy. Let's look at fallbacks first. A fallback is a tactical repositioning of your forces, when you decide it's not in your interests to chase the enemy any further. Some players like to refer to a fallback move as a fallback in good order, or a fallback and regroup, just to avoid any confusion with a retreat. To make a fallback move, a unit rolls 3 dice. The total number rolled on the dice is the maximum distance the unit may move when falling back. In this case, 10 centimeters. The direction a unit may move when making a fallback is anywhere behind the line of fighting. So in our example, it's anywhere beneath the red shaded area. Provided no stand moves further than 10 centimeters, the unit falling back can do so in any direction and into any formation they wish behind the line of fighting. So the swordsman could slide 10 centimeters to the left or 10 centimeters to the right from their original position. They could move 10 centimeters straight backwards if they want to. They could realign themselves at an angle or into a column formation, and provided the stands have enough movement they can end up facing whatever direction they wish. A player that has just won a round of close combat may still decide to fall back if they think it is in their best interests. Falling back will immediately end the close combat between the two units. So if you managed to win the first round through luck, but don't think you're going to be so lucky in the second round, falling back is often a good option. Additionally, you might want to set up a flank charge against the enemy if you know it's your turn to move next, and falling back allows you to move into such a position. Or maybe there's some defendable terrain nearby that a fallback move will allow you to move into. Or you might wish to fall back amongst your own lines to set up a more solid battle line for next turn. A unit which has outstanding hits left on any of its stands after the round of combat may wish to fall back. And this is because at the end of the combat phase, any unengaged units which still have outstanding hits on any of their stands are allowed to recover their outstanding hits, provided they're no longer in combat. However, this benefit also applies to the enemy, so they will recover their hits as well as you. When falling back, there is no minimum distance that your unit has to move. so one or more of your victorious stands could hold position whilst other stands manoeuvre around them. However, if you choose to make a fallback move, and after moving you still have any stands within 1 centimetre of the enemy or 1 centimetre of any friendly units engaged in combat, then your unit becomes confused. We will discuss fallbacks in greater detail when we talk about drawn combats later on. But now we shall move on to the second option that a victorious unit has, and that is to stand its ground. Returning to our simple example, the swordsmen can choose to stand their ground whilst the skeletons retreat, meaning the swordsmen don't move at all. This is often a good option if your unit already occupies a defendable position. Standing your ground also ends the combat between the two units, so will also allow a unit with outstanding hits to recover them at the end of the combat phase. We'll now look at the third option that a unit which is victorious in combat has, and that is to pursue the retreating enemy. The main reason to pursue an enemy is to continue the fight, because you're allowed to fight a second round of combat when you pursue. If we return to our original simple example, we remember that the skeletons had to retreat 2 centimetres because they lost the combat by 2. The swordsmen now decide they will pursue the retreating skeletons. In order to pursue the skeletons, the swordsmen must be able to see them, and the pursuing unit can move up to a full pace move in order to make contact. In this example, the skeletons are within line of sight and within a full pace move of the swordsman. There are some further restrictions on what units can pursue. Firstly, infantry units are not allowed to pursue cavalry or chariot units if this means they end up in front edge-to-edge contact with the retreating cavalry or chariots. Secondly, artillery are never allowed to pursue any type of unit. Thirdly, fortified units will never pursue any retreating enemy either. Fourthly, you're not allowed to pursue enemy that has retreated into terrain which you cannot enter. And fifthly, non-flying units are not allowed to pursue flying units if that means they end up in front edge-to-edge contact with them. In our simple example, none of these restrictions apply, so the swordsman can pursue the skeletons. To make your pursuit move, you simply start with any stand which has an enemy stand directly in front of it. In this case, the leftmost stand of swordsmen has an enemy stand directly in front of it. Any pursuing stand which can move directly forwards so that its front edge contacts the retreating enemy must do so. In our example, there is just one stand to which this applies, and this stand moves first. Once all the stands from the pursuing unit which have to move into front edge contact with the enemy have done so, then any remaining stands can be positioned around the enemy unit as you wish, provided they don't break formation with the first stand. So in this example, we've moved the second pursuing stand so that it's still touching the first pursuing stand, but is now in the flank of the enemy unit. Alternately, we could simply move the second pursuing stand up so that it's in line with the first stand, or we could place it in a supporting position, or we could move it into contact with the second enemy stand. Provided the pursuing stands do not move further than a full pace move, and they're moving closer to the enemy, then you can arrange them in whatever formation you wish. The only thing you're not allowed to do is move pursuing stands away from the enemy and then back again. So if in our example there was some impassable terrain right in front of the second pursuing stand, then the second pursuing stand would not be allowed to move around it to rejoin the first stand, because it would be making a circuitous route which takes it away from the enemy and then back again. In our simple example, we decide to move the pursuing stands into this formation, as this allows us to maximize our attacks whilst reducing the enemy's attacks. Once a unit has completed its pursuit move, then you immediately fight a second round of combat. Any hits already sustained in the first round of combat are carried over against both units which fight in the second round. A unit which is pursuing a retreating enemy gets to increase the number of attacks it can make in the second round. A pursuing unit always gains +1 attack per stand, and they get an additional bonus attack per stand for every full 3 centimeters that they pursue the enemy. There's no upper limit to this bonus. So if you pursue an enemy 3 centimeters, you get +2 attacks per stand, 6 centimeters it's +3, 9 centimeters it's +4, and so on. In any case, it is always the distance that the enemy retreated which counts towards this attack bonus, not the physical distance that individual pursuing stands have to move in order to maintain contact. In our simple example, the retreat was 2 centimeters, so the pursuit is 2 centimeters, so each stand gets +1 attack. Meanwhile, the skeletons now have an enemy stand in the flank of one of their stands, so they will lose 1 attack. The Dogs of War infantry roll their attacks and score 4 hits. The skeletons make their armor saves and fail to save a single hit. We record the number of hits sustained by the skeletons in this second round of combat. Because the skeletons already have some hits carried over from the first round of combat, I prefer to use a separate marker to record hits that are sustained in the second round to avoid any confusion. The skeletons make their attacks and manage to score 3 hits on the Dogs of War swordsmen. The swordsmen make 3 armor rolls and save 1 hit. We record the 2 hits sustained by the swordsmen, and then we determine who has won this second round. Because the skeletons have sustained 6 hits in total, that's enough to remove both of their remaining stands. And when determining the winner, if one side is wiped out, the other side wins. So the Dogs of War swordsmen are victorious. If the swordsmen had not managed to wipe out the skeletons during this second round of combat, then the units would not fight a third round. In Warmaster you can only fight a maximum of 2 rounds of combat each turn against the same enemy unit. The only way you can fight more than 2 rounds of combat is if you destroy your enemy and advance to fight a new enemy unit in the same turn. We will discuss advances in more detail later on. However, in our example the skeletons are wiped out, so the swordsmen get to choose what happens next. As their enemy have been wiped out, there is no retreat and the Dogs of War will not pursue again. So the Dogs of War swordsmen can now choose whether to fall back, stand their ground, or if there's another enemy within 20 centimeters, they can advance. In our example there are no other enemies nearby, so the Dogs of War elect to fall back. They roll 3 dice for their fallback move and score 7. Because the swordsmen have 2 stands which were arranged facing in different directions, and both stands were fighting the enemy to their front, then the direction of the fallback will be determined by which stand you choose to move first. If you choose the right hand stand, then the fallback must be made to the right of the white line. If you choose the left hand stand, then the fallback move must be made below the white line. We choose to go with the left hand stand, so we move no stand further than 7 centimeters, so their final position looks like this. And then at the end of the second combat round, because the swordsmen are no longer engaged in combat, any outstanding hits are removed. So that example is what may happen when one side wins a combat engagement. But what happens when both sides have an equal score in combat? Well, if the combat is a draw, the rulebook tells us that both sides have to fall back. However, if one side of the drawn combat occupies a defended or fortified position, they don't have to fall back, they can hold position. If neither side is defended or fortified, then you roll a dice to determine which side has to fall back first. 1, 2 or 3 it's you, 4, 5 or 6 it's your opponent. In this example, the Tomb King's chariots are fighting the Dogs of War knights. Both sides inflict 4 hits on the other, and after casualty removal the units look like this. With 4 hits aside, the combat is a draw, so we roll a dice to see which unit has to fall back first. In this example, the Tomb Kings fall back first, they roll their fallback move and get a total of 12. In a drawn combat, units are allowed to maintain contact with the enemy as they move into their final position. So in effect the chariots slide along the front of the knight unit as they move sideways 12 centimeters. This is perfectly fine, and provided the final position of the unit falling back is at least a centimetre away from the enemy, they won't be confused. The knights then make their fallback move, and not wishing to be charged in the flank next turn, they simply reposition so that they're facing the chariots once again. As both units are now unengaged, at the end of the combat phase they will recover any outstanding hits. In this example, the knights are surrounded on three sides by chariots and raised dead. If the combat is a draw, then the knights are allowed to slide sideways out of the combat engagement. In this example, the bone giant has drawn combat against the swordsmen. He is also surrounded on three sides, but is allowed to slide backwards away from the enemy as he falls back. When falling back out of combat, you're not allowed to make contact with any enemy units which you weren't fighting. In this example, the swordsmen have drawn the combat with the skeletons and must fall back, but due to the impassable terrain, the only place for them to fall back to is directly backwards into contact with the skeleton chariots. This is not allowed. So even though they're falling back, the swordsmen don't actually move, and at the end of their fallback move they're automatically confused, because they can't move more than a centimetre away from the enemy. So far we've discussed retreat, pursuit and fallbacks. Now let's look at advances. An advance is the final option that a victorious unit has at the end of combat. An advance is essentially another charge, but it has to be made against the closest visible enemy within 20 centimetres. And you have to satisfy a number of criteria before you're allowed to advance. To be eligible to make an advance move, you must have destroyed all the enemy you were fighting within 2 rounds of combat. Now, if you're just fighting one enemy unit, this is easy enough. You just have to inflict enough hits on the enemy unit to remove all their stands as casualties by the end of the second combat round, and you get your advance move. If, however, you're fighting more than one enemy unit, this is a bit more difficult to achieve, as every enemy unit in combat with you must have been destroyed by the end of the second round of combat for you to get your advance move. And this does include all supporting enemy infantry units, as any infantry unit which has stands supporting a combat is included in the combat, and this means supporting infantry units are affected by the combat results, and do count as enemies for the purposes of calculating whether you get to advance or not. So, if you kill off all the stands of the unit you're actually fighting, but don't kill off the supporting unit as well, you can't advance. You're only ever allowed to make one advance move per turn, so you can't advance if you already have done so that turn. You're not allowed to advance into terrain which you cannot enter. Fortified units and artillery units are never allowed to advance. And you must have a clear path to reach your target in order to advance. An advance move is very similar to a charge by initiative. You have to advance against the closest visible enemy unit within 20 centimetres. However, no stand can move further than 20 centimetres when making an advance, regardless of the unit's full pace move. If applicable, an infantry unit making an advance can bring another infantry unit in support, and this works much the same way as an infantry unit doing a supporting charge. If you make an advance move into an enemy missile unit, then they are allowed to stand and shoot at you, just as they would against a charger. Although an advance move is essentially the same as a charge move, there's one key difference. An advancing unit gets no bonus to attacks for charging the enemy. So generally speaking, an advancing unit fights only with its basic number of attacks. The lack of bonus attacks and the limit of a 20 centimetre move for an advance represents the unit's exhaustion. If you advance into an enemy unit which has not fought in combat that turn, then you are allowed to fight up to 2 rounds of combat against that new enemy unit. And the usual rules for retreats, pursuits and fallbacks apply. Just remember that you can never make a second advance move. But what happens if you advance into a combat engagement where you're already fighting the enemy with another of your units? Where this occurs, if the enemy unit has not yet fought in the combat phase, then your advancing unit will be included in the combat round against that enemy unit. However, if the combat has already been worked out that turn and you advance into it, you're not allowed to fight any further rounds of combat against the enemy. Instead, the advancing unit simply becomes part of the ongoing combat, which is worked out in the following turn. Let's look at the subject of unresolved combats in more detail. It will sometimes happen that despite you fighting 2 rounds of combat, you still haven't destroyed the enemy. If you elect to pursue into contact with the retreating enemy, then you don't fight a 3rd round of combat. Instead, the combat becomes unresolved, and all units engaged will stay that way until next turn. Any hits sustained by either side in the combat will roll over into the following turn, so you must retain the hit markers on all units. You will also need to place a marker to remember which unit is pursuing and how many bonus pursuit attacks they get next turn. Staying locked in combat in this manner is a tactical choice. You may wish to do this where you've inflicted a large amount of damage on the enemy and don't wish them to recover their hits at the end of the combat phase. However, if it's the enemy's turn next, then you do run the risk of being charged by enemy units which rush in to support their beleaguered friends. We've now covered the basics of retreats, pursuits, fallbacks and advances. However, combat results can be one of the most complicated aspects of the game, especially when you involve multiple units per side. So let's look at some examples where multiple units per side will impact upon retreats and pursuits. If several units are engaged on the losing side of the same combat, then the distance that each unit must retreat is divided by the total number of units which were fighting on the losing side. And this does include any supporting units, and it also includes any units which were wiped out that round. In this example, there are 4 units of swordsmen fighting against the undead. If the swordsmen lose, then they will divide their retreat distance by 4, as they have 2 units fighting and 2 units supporting. So even if the front 2 fighting units were completely wiped out, the supporting units would still retreat a distance divided by 4. When dividing a retreat distance in this manner, you always round up to the nearest whole number. So this means you'll always retreat at least 1 centimetre, even if the divided retreat distance is less than 1. In this example, if we say that the swordsmen lost the combat by 5, then 5 divided by 4 is 1 1/4, and 1 1/4 is rounded up to 2, so any surviving units retreat 2 centimetres. A retreating unit always retreats away from the enemy which it's fighting, and which is in edge-to-edge contact. Because supporting units are always included in the combat, and are affected by the combat results, they have to retreat as well as the units which actually fought. But it may occur that a supporting unit doesn't actually have any stands in contact with the enemy. When a supporting unit retreats, it automatically follows the same line of retreat as the unit which it supported, even if that unit was wiped out in the combat. So in our example, the rearmost 2 supporting units will retreat directly backwards. When you have more than 1 unit retreating on the losing side, then the owning player always determines the order in which retreating units will retreat. The direction of a retreat may be less clear if the unit is fighting enemies to more than one side. In this case, the retreating unit will retreat away from the greatest number of touching enemy stands. In this example, the swordsmen are fighting a 1-stand bone giant to the front and 3 stands of chariots to the flank. In cases where the enemy stands are touching only via corner-to-corner contact, the enemy stands count as being in contact with the relevant edge of the retreating unit's stand that is parallel to the enemy stand's frontage. So by drawing a straight line across the front of the chariot unit, we see that the swordsmen are contacted by all 3 chariots in their side edge. Consequently, the swordsmen will have to retreat away from the chariots. Where a unit is in irregular formation, it may not always be clear in which direction it has to retreat, as it may be contacted by enemy stands from several directions. In this case, whichever of the retreating unit's stands has the most enemy stands in edge contact with it will determine the direction of the retreat. So in this example, the skeleton stand that has 2 enemy knight units touching it determines the direction of retreat for the whole unit. If a retreating unit has an equal number of enemy stands in contact with more than one side, then the owning player decides from which enemy unit the losing unit will retreat. It can sometimes happen that a stand retreating from combat will have its path of retreat blocked. This is very bad, as a retreating stand which has its retreat blocked will be destroyed. A blocked retreat occurs when any part of a retreating stand's base contacts any of the following: impassable terrain, enemy stands, friendly stands that are already engaged in combat, friendly stands that have already retreated, or any unengaged enemy stands which refuse to make way. We will discuss making way in greater detail when we do a video about confusion, but for now it's sufficient to understand that unengaged enemy stands usually have the option to move out of the way of a retreating friendly stand. In this example, the knights have been charged in the flank by the bone giant, and their opposite flank is in contact with the broken ground, which counts as impassable terrain for cavalry. The knights lose the combat and must retreat 1 centimeter. One stand from the retreating knight unit makes contact with the broken ground. This is a blocked retreat, so the stand is immediately removed as a casualty. Losing a stand to a blocked retreat does not reduce the number of outstanding hits sustained by the unit, so the knights are still carrying their 2 hits. In this example, the skeletons have lost combat against the swordsmen and must retreat 1 centimeter. The skeletons remove their casualties before retreating. The supporting unit of skeletons must retreat in the same direction as the fighting unit of skeletons, but the supporting unit has 2 stands which have blocked retreats caused by the enemy light cavalry. The 2 supporting stands which have their retreat blocked are removed as casualties. In this example, the light cavalry has just lost a combat against the chariots. The light cavalry removes casualties and must retreat 3 centimeters. One stand from the light cavalry has its retreat blocked by the friendly supporting stand of the unit of swordsmen. Supporting units do count as being engaged in combat, so one stand of light cavalry must be removed as a casualty, whilst the remaining stand retains the hits caused. In this example, the 2 units of swordsmen have just lost combat against the skeletons to their front and the chariots to their flank. The swordsmen remove their casualties and must retreat. The rearmost swordsman unit retreats first. It has 3 chariot stands touching its flanks and must retreat away from the chariots. The frontmost unit of swordsmen then retreats second. They have to retreat directly backwards away from the skeletons. However, the retreat of one stand of this unit of swordsmen is blocked by the second unit of swordsmen which have already retreated from the same combat. Therefore, the frontmost retreating swordsman unit loses one stand for a blocked retreat, and the remaining hits are applied to the surviving stand. Also note that in this case, the retreating surviving stand maintains contact with its flank against the chariots. This is permitted, and the fact that the chariots are in the flank of the retreating stand does not mean that that stand is destroyed, as the chariots are not blocking the direction of retreat of the stand. Where this occurs, it's known as incidental contact, and can be quite common when fighting enemies to both the front and the flank. In this example, the swordsmen have just lost combat against the skeletons and must retreat 1 centimeter. The centremost swordsman stand has its retreat blocked by the presence of the enemy sphinx. This centremost stand is removed as a casualty for a blocked retreat. However, this action has broken the formation of the swordsmen. Where a retreating unit breaks formation in this way, you must remove one of the surviving stands as an additional casualty, so that once the retreat is complete, the retreating unit is back in a legal formation. An artillery unit which is forced to retreat is automatically removed as a casualty. This intentionally makes artillery extremely vulnerable to close combat attacks, as simply winning combat by 1 point is sufficient to remove the entire unit. A retreating unit may no longer claim defended status, even if it's still within defensible terrain, as the unit is assumed to have given up its prepared positions as it runs away from the enemy. By the same token, a unit which is pursuing a retreating enemy, or a unit which is advancing, cannot claim defended status either, even if it has moved into terrain which would grant it defended status. So a good rule of thumb to remember is that infantry or artillery can only ever claim defended status if they haven't moved in any way that turn. If they retreat, if they pursue, or if they advance, they're no longer defended. Let's now revisit the subject of pursuits. We previously touched upon the subject of which units can pursue and which units can't pursue. Page 47 of the rulebook clarifies the restrictions on pursuit. So let's see how this works in practice. Looking at artillery units first, we see that they can never pursue any type of retreating enemy. Fighting in close combat is not what artillery is designed for. So this is why it's often important to protect your artillery pieces with friendly infantry or other units who can pursue the enemy. Fortified units will also never pursue the enemy, as they're unwilling to give up their heavily protected position. You can't pursue an enemy that has retreated into terrain which you cannot enter, so in this example the cavalry can't pursue the retreating infantry as the infantry have entered the wood, and woods count as impassable to cavalry. Non-flying units are not allowed to pursue flying units if the non-flying pursuing units would end up in front edge-to-edge contact with the retreating flyers. And likewise, infantry can't pursue retreating cavalry or chariots if that would put the infantry in front edge-to-edge contact with them. However, infantry can pursue monsters just fine. The restrictions imposed upon infantry pursuing cavalry and chariots are worth a second look, as if you've only ever played original Warmaster, the changes brought about by Warmaster Revolution are easy to miss. In this example, the undead units have charged the ogres and swordsmen who are defended on the hill. The ogres and swordsmen manage to win the combat, so the undead units retreat 2 centimeters. The ogres and swordsmen wish to pursue the retreating sphinx and skeletons, but in doing so the ogre unit makes contact with the front edge of the chariot unit which has retreated from the same combat. This is not allowed, as infantry are never allowed to pursue straight forwards into front edge-to-edge contact with retreating cavalry or chariots, even if they are legally pursuing other units. So in this example, the chariots have actually covered the retreat of the infantry and sphinx, which means the ogres cannot pursue at all. In this example, the dogs of war swordsmen have charged into the skeletons and have contacted the skeleton cavalry corner to corner. The swordsmen win the engagement and the skeleton units retreat 2 centimeters. The swordsmen are then allowed to pursue the skeleton infantry by moving straight forwards. This brings the swordsmen back into corner to corner contact with the retreating skeleton cavalry. And this is perfectly fine, as it's only front edge to edge contact between retreating cavalry or chariots and pursuing infantry, which is not allowed. Now here's the bit that many players overlook, especially if you're used to original Warmaster rules. Pursuing infantry can't contact the front edge of retreating cavalry or chariots, but they are allowed to pursue against the side or rear edge of retreating cavalry or chariots. Now you may argue that this is not what the rules intend, but as they are written, this is what the rules permit, and it does allow infantry to effectively threaten cavalry or chariots if you can charge them in the flank. In this example, 2 units of swordsmen have charged the chariot unit in the flank. The swordsmen win the combat and the chariots retreat. And provided no swordsman stand is compelled to move forwards so that it's in front edge-to-edge contact with the chariot stand, they are allowed to pursue the chariots. Ironically, if the swordsmen were to move their pursuing stands so that they did end up in front edge-to-edge contact with the chariots, the pursuit would be illegal, as this would contravene the rules as written. So, provided the pursuing infantry do not pursue into front edge-to-edge contact with the chariots, assuming they win a second round, they would be able to pursue the chariots once again. In this example, the ogres have charged the enemy chariots in the front. The ogres win combat, and after casualty removal, the chariots retreat, leaving the units positioned as follows. The ogre unit now has no stands which have to move directly forwards in order to pursue. But as they can still see the retreating enemy, they can make what is known as an indirect pursuit. To do an indirect pursuit, you select one pursuing stand and move it in a straight path towards the closest visible retreating enemy stand in the same way you would for a charge. Any other pursuing stands can then be placed in formation with the first stand as you wish. So in our example, it doesn't matter which of the 2 ogre stands we pick to start the indirect pursuit. As they are both in the flank of the chariots, then one of the stands will be moved into edge-to-edge contact with the chariot's flank. We move one stand into the flank edge of the chariots, and then the other stand can be positioned behind the chariots. So through clever positioning, it is entirely legal for an infantry unit to pursue a retreating cavalry or chariot unit, provided they don't make contact with the front edge, even when you've charged them in the front. And assuming the ogres win their second round of combat, they're allowed to pursue the chariots once again. Because the wording for pursuing flying units is written exactly as it is for pursuing cavalry or chariots, then non-flyers are permitted to pursue flyers if you don't have to move any stands into front edge-to-edge contact with the retreating flying unit. The first rule of any pursuit is that any stands which can move directly forwards into front edge-to-edge contact with the enemy must do so. However, this rule is waived if doing so would cause the pursuing unit to split its formation. In this example, 2 units of swordsmen are fighting 2 undead units. The swordsmen win combat, and after casualty removal, the undead retreat and the swordsmen pursue them. However, the rearmost unit of swordsmen now has 2 enemy stands directly in front of its left and rightmost stands, on opposite sides of the formation. If both these swordsmen stands were to pursue directly forwards, that would split the swordsmen's formation, as there's no way the third swordsman stand can connect the other 2. Instead, the rearmost swordsman unit selects one of the 2 stands which must pursue straight forwards to do so, and then the rest of the pursuing stands are formed up in a legal formation. Where infantry are supporting each other in combat, it may sometimes happen that the fighting unit will pursue a retreating enemy, and the supporting unit is left with no line of sight to the same retreating enemy. In these circumstances, the supporting unit is allowed to make a supporting pursuit. To make a supporting pursuit, an infantry unit must move at least one stand straight forwards so that it ends up directly behind or directly beside a unit that has already pursued and is fighting the enemy. In this example, 2 swordsman units are fighting 2 skeleton units. These skeletons lose combat and retreat. The front unit of swordsmen then pursue, but in doing so they block the line of sight of the rearmost unit of swordsmen, who now have no line of sight to any retreating skeleton stands. In this case, the rearmost unit of swordsmen are allowed to make a supporting pursuit. They move all 3 of their stands straight forward so that they're directly behind the first unit of swordsmen. Note that one of the stands of the swordsmen in a supporting pursuit has actually ended up in corner-to-corner contact with the enemy. This is fine, and they will now actually fight in the second round rather than supporting. However, a stand making a supporting pursuit move is never allowed to move into edge-to-edge contact with an enemy stand. Another way that an infantry unit may make a supporting pursuit is where they can see enemy stands that have retreated from the combat but can't actually make it into edge-to-edge contact with them. In this example, 2 units of swordsmen are fighting a single unit of skeletons. The swordsmen win and the skeletons remove casualties and retreat next to some impassable terrain. The first unit of swordsmen pursue the retreating skeletons and block off all the available edge contact for the second unit, although the second unit still has line of sight to the skeletons. In this case, the second unit is still allowed to make a supporting pursuit. 2 of their stands move directly forwards to support the fighting stands, whilst the third stand on the right moves into corner-to-corner contact with the skeletons. A unit that is victorious in combat may sometimes find itself unable to pursue the retreating enemy. This will often occur when non-flyers fight flyers to the front, or infantry fight cavalry or chariots to the front. However, there are some other situations where this will happen. Where a victorious unit cannot place any stands into pursuit contact with the enemy or into a supporting pursuit position, then it has to hold or fall back. In this example, the 2 units of swordsmen are side by side, fighting 1 unit of skeletons. The swordsmen win the combat and the skeletons retreat. The first unit of swordsmen pursue in such a way that the second unit of swordsmen now have no line of sight to the retreating skeletons. Furthermore, the second unit of swordsmen cannot move any of their stands straight forwards into a supporting position. This means the second unit of swordsmen cannot make a supporting pursuit and must fall back or hold position. In this example, the unit of knights have been charged in the flanks and the rear by undead units. By some miracle, the knights actually win combat and the undead units must retreat. However, because all the undead units have retreated out of the line of sight of the knight unit, then the knights can't pursue any of them, because they can't see them. Now this may seem counterintuitive, but this is what the rules say, and it does reward attacking the enemy in the flank and rear. There is one exception where you are allowed to pursue an enemy that has retreated out of your line of sight, and this is dealt with by the errata produced by the Rules Committee. In this example, the swordsmen are fighting skeletons in a wood. The swordsmen are victorious and the skeletons retreat 3 centimeters. Line of sight to units in a wood is restricted to 2 centimeters, so the rules as written state the swordsmen can no longer see the skeletons. However, in this case, the Rules Committee has decided that this would be unfair on the pursuing unit, so a unit is allowed to pursue an enemy that has retreated more than 2 centimeters into a wood, provided the pursuing unit is normally allowed to enter woods. When you move a pursuing unit into contact with a retreating enemy, you may contact a separate enemy unit which wasn't fighting in the combat. This is called incidental contact. In this example, the swordsmen are fighting 2 units of skeletons. They win combat and the skeletons retreat. The skeletons have retreated so that they are now in contact with 2 friendly units, who did not fight in the combat. When the swordsmen pursue, they will bring these other 2 units into the combat engagement. On the left hand side, 1 stand of swordsmen is touching the skeleton cavalry corner to corner, so the skeleton cavalry will fight in the next round of combat. On the right hand side, 1 stand of swordsmen is contacting the bone giant with flank edge to edge contact, so the bone giant will fight against them in the upcoming round of combat. Note that 1 stand of swordsmen doing a supporting pursuit is now in corner to corner contact with both skeletons and the bone giant. This is fine, provided it's not in edge to edge contact with either stand. So in this example, both the cavalry and the bone giant will fight in the second round of combat against the swordsmen. However, the pursuing swordsmen only get their pursuit bonus attacks against the skeletons, not against any new units which they're fighting through incidental contact. And regardless of who wins this second round of combat, no third round will be fought. So the bone giant and cavalry will only fight 1 round of combat. So what happens when incidental contact from one combat engagement happens against units engaged in a separate combat? Here we have a unit of swordsmen fighting a unit of skeletons, and a unit of light cavalry fighting a unit of skeleton cavalry. The engagement featuring the swordsmen is worked out first. They win and the skeletons retreat. The swordsmen now pursue, and in doing so one of their stands makes incidental contact with a stand of the skeleton cavalry. What happens next entirely depends upon whether the engagement between the skeleton cavalry and light cavalry has already been worked out this turn, or if it has not. If the cavalry engagement has not yet been worked out, then they are drawn into the combat featuring the infantry as well, and this counts as one multiple combat, but because the infantry have already fought one round, then when the cavalry units fight, they will be fighting in the infantry's second round of combat, so only get to make one round of attacks themselves. However, if the cavalry engagement had already been worked out before the swordsmen pursued into them, then no further rounds of combat will be fought this turn, as no unit may fight more than 2 rounds of combat against the same enemy or enemies in the same turn. If this were the case, then all the units would now stay locked in combat and the engagement would be worked out in the following turn. It goes without saying that should the incidental contact occur after 2 rounds of pursuit, then the unit brought into combat by the incidental contact will not get to fight that round, and all units engaged will be locked in combat, which will then be resolved next turn. Incidental contact from a second round of pursuit can sometimes have a negative effect upon an ongoing combat engagement. Here we have undead cavalry and chariots fighting against dogs of war cavalry units. The undead units lose combat, remove casualties and retreat. When the dogs of war units pursue, the combat is split into 2 separate engagements. The engagement on the left is worked out first, which results in the surviving undead cavalry stand retreating back into contact with the undead chariots. If the light cavalry pursue the retreating skeleton cavalry in such a way that they make contact with the skeleton chariots as well, even if it's only corner to corner, then this counts as incidental contact in the second round of pursuit, which means the chariots and the knights will not get to complete their second round of combat, because they've effectively been brought back into one large engagement with the light cavalry and the skeleton cavalry, both of whom have already fought 2 rounds of combat this turn. It is worth reiterating that a pursuit move can only ever be made against an enemy which has retreated from the same combat. If it's impossible to pursue, for example because you've killed off all the enemy stands in a unit, then you can't pursue. You will have to stand your ground, fall back, or, if circumstances allow, you can advance. It can sometimes happen that units on the losing side of a combat will retreat in such a way that they're no longer engaged. This is known as a combat dropout. In this example, the ogres have been charged on 3 sides by undead units. The ogres manage to win combat, so the undead units retreat away in 3 different directions. The ogres pursue the retreating skeleton archers, leaving the retreating skeleton warriors and retreating skeleton cavalry unengaged. It's important to note that the skeleton units which have dropped out of combat have already fought 1 round of combat this turn, because if other dogs of war units were nearby, they might bring the skeleton units back into combat through incidental contact. Also of note is the fact that even when the ogres destroy the last remaining skeleton archer stand, they can't then make an advance move back into contact with either the infantry or the skeleton cavalry. Because don't forget, you can only make an advance move if you've destroyed all the enemy units you are fighting. And the ogres have already fought both these units and not destroyed them. This now concludes the video on combat results, and if you've stuck through it to the end, then well done, as this is the longest video I've produced so far on the rules, and it covers a variety of very complex topics. As always, if there is anything you feel is unclear, or if there are any rules that you disagree with, please let me know in the comments below. In the next video we're going to discuss the topic of confusion, and in particular how retreating units can force others to make way and become confused in multiple combats. Until then, keep building those armies.